I'll be coordinating the session and speaking as well. And so welcome to the last day of the workshop. It's been a long week. People have been pretty exhausted by now, I presume. So I'm going to keep the talk fairly light. Okay? Lots of pictures. Not cool animations. Okay, so Sridhar trumps all of us there. I mean, he showed way too many cool animations, but I'll try to keep the talk light. And if you have questions, just as usual, feel free to ask. And as usual, turn on the mic and ask. Okay. Fine. So let's start off. I'm going to talk about exploiting structure in the problem while doing reinforcement learning. So, in some sense, a lot of the talks that we have heard so far have been about exploiting structure. Whenever we talk about parameterizations, right? So, whenever we talk about representations, learning representations, and so on and so forth, all of these are about exploiting structure that is present in the problem, right? And I'm going to specifically talk about hierarchical RL. So, Rich alluded to options, but we didn't really hear much about hierarchies in the other talks, right? So I'm going to talk about hierarchical RL and some of the things that we have been doing and some larger questions that I would like addressed in the hierarchical RL context, right? And so one of the key, so this will be more closer in flavor to what Mausam and Satinder spoke about rather than the more mathematically rigorous half of the talks that we have seen so far. So one of the key requirements that you would want for intelligent behavior, right, is the ability to abstract, right? Ignore unnecessary aspects. First of all, figure out what are unnecessary aspects in the world, so ignore them, okay, and then form representations that allow you to take advantage of your knowledge, right? So you could have things like spatial abstractions, okay, where you are ignoring irrelevant sensory inputs, ignoring irrelevant features in the state space, forming a much more reduced representation of the state if need be, okay, and then trying to work with that abstract representation. Okay. You could also have temporal abstractions, right? So temporal abstractions are where you are ignoring fine-grained control details. Right? So for example, this is something which I always give. As a baby, you need to learn how to stand, right? Because you have so many fine motor commands that actually need to operate for you to be able to stand. Otherwise, babies try to stand up, they fall down. Right? But now you don't think twice about standing, right? Because you have abstracted away all these fine-grained details, and you are able to think of an action that says stand. And you are able to just say, okay, fine, I can stand. I know the policy. Okay, I know how to stand. Right, so this is the very, very fundamental way of thinking about temporal abstraction. So I ignore passage of time and the fine-grained details that I have to execute in that. So in some sense you can also think of this as policy abstraction, in the sense that I'm not worried about the details of the policy, I give the policy a label and then I'm executing the policy. So what happens in the interim when the policy is executing is not something that I need to pay attention to. So I could call that temporal or policy abstraction, right? So typically you abstract these things as a skill, So it could be like turning a screw in. If you think about it, it involves a lot of fine motor control, right? But you don't think twice about doing something like that, right? It's not something which you can do inherently. It's not an ability you're born with. You have to learn it somewhere along the way. But now you know how to do it. Even if you have never ever held a screwdriver and turned a screw before, okay, if I tell you, okay, hey, this is what you have to do, immediately you're able to catch on to it and you're able to do this. So there's some level of representation that you're building for not just for the world, but also for motor commands. Right? So this is something which is like, so sometimes in robotics they call this control basis. So you learn a basis of control functions, and when you want to do complex behaviors, you kind of synthesize those behaviors from the control basis. So, but so we still need to work on turning that into a viable framework, right? So the key questions to ask, I would say, are what are useful skills, right? How to acquire them, how to represent and retrieve them. Lots of, I'll talk more about it as we go along. These are issues, but unfortunately, a lot of work in the RL community is only focused on the second question. At least whatever work is there in this domain is more focused on the second question. So before we get on to answering these questions, we need a formal framework in which to ask these questions. And there's been a lot of work that has been done in terms of hierarchical frameworks for RL, where you can look at spatial and temporal abstractions together, right? So the chief of these is the options framework, which Rich spoke about a little bit. I'll also talk about options predominantly in this talk. But then there are a bunch of other things. There's this framework called MaxQ due to Tom Dietrich, and then there is this framework called Hierarchy of Abstract Machines, called HAMS, due to Ron Parr and Stuart Russell, which have different ways of decomposing these larger problems into simpler problems that you have to solve. So here's an example. So we'll come back to this problem later. It's a navigation problem where you have to pick up, you're controlling a taxi that has to pick up passengers. So you can break it down into saying that, okay, so get a passenger and put him wherever he wants. Okay, these are the two problems that you have to solve. Right? Now getting a passenger in turn consists of, okay, you have to first go where the passenger is, then pick him up. Likewise, putting a passenger consists of, okay, go where the passenger wants to go and then put him down. Okay, so these are the things, and then if you try to pick up a passenger from wherever the passenger is not present, it's not going to succeed. Likewise, if you try to put down a passenger where he doesn't want to go, well, you might still succeed, but he might get a huge negative reward because the passenger is probably not going to pay you, or and so on and so forth, right? And the navigation task in turn has all this north, south, east, west movements, which should all be familiar to you guys because we have seen enough number of grid worlds. So those are basically the actions in the grid world, right? So you can think about it. So what has happened here is that instead of actually thinking in terms of north, south, east and west when I want to get to a place, I just have a single option which tells me navigate to that place, right? Or a single action that tells me navigate to that place. And when I'm planning on how to get a passenger into my car, I don't have to worry about this primitive north, south, east, west actions. All I need to worry about is, okay, go to where he is and pick him up. Right? So if you think, if I don't know how many of you remember the airplane, the photography task that Rich was talking about, unmanned aircraft, where you had to go to a point, take a picture. He was showing you demos of a thing flying around, taking pictures, right? So that had very similar kind of options. So you didn't have to tell it, okay, fly in this orientation and so on and so forth. You just needed to tell it, okay, go to point 1 or go to point 2 or go to point 3. Those were the actions. At any point in the state space, it had only 5 actions. So go to one of, or 6 actions. Go to one of those 5 slates, 5 points where you need to photograph, or go to base. So one of those 6 actions. So likewise, so what we are going to have here is, well, navigate to one of the 4 locations that a passenger could be at. I mean, there are only 4 pickup points in the world. Okay, the actions here would be go to one of those 4 pickup points. Okay, so you can basically get the idea of what the abstract actions are going to look like. Right? So there are many variations of it, and I guess more or less the community is kind of standardizing onto options and MaxQ as the hierarchical frameworks of choice, even though HAMS are probably a more complete framework than either of the two, even though it just maybe because of the reason that it is a complete framework becomes more complex and a little harder to understand, so people are not really taking to it in a big way. Yeah, please.
So what are the requirements for a framework? So what are you willing to call a framework? I'm wondering about like what constitutes a valid framework in your opinion? Like why these and why HAM is more complete than the others? What are the necessary ingredients?
Good point. So well, what I would call a framework is a mechanism for defining the temporal abstractions. So how would you define this kind of long range actions? When I say navigate, right? So there should be a representation for how navigate would be implemented. I mean, there should be some definition of how I'll define, how I'll describe a subtask. Okay? So that is one thing that we're looking at. The second should be mechanisms for learning solutions to these. Okay? So solutions to the larger problem by putting together the smaller pieces. So what options lacks is the fact that don't really have any mechanism in them for learning what these options are. Options are typically pre-specified. I know that there have been a lot of ad hoc add-ons to the options framework later, which allows you to learn policies along the way and so on and so forth. But the basic options framework itself, right, does not talk about those. And the fact that it's not something I was planning to get into, but when you are executing an option, if you look at the agent executing an option in the world, right, it looks non-Markov because the actions are not just a function of the state, but it's a function of what option you are running as well. And these things are not explicitly dealt with in the options framework. Right? While the ham framework has a call stack, it describes the complete state of the system at every point, including what is the ham that is running and so on and so forth, which is missing from the options framework. That's why I say hams are more complete.
So I have a comment on this. So the ham framework, on the other hand, it can be viewed as putting additional restrictions on how you can deal with macros or if you wish,
yes,
options.
Both
right?
MaxQ and hams do that, yeah.
So in some sense it's less general because the options allows you to do whatever, right, on the top of options. And the hams tells you that you should do it this way. You have to keep in your state representation of whatever you're executing and so on and so forth. So more restrictions you put on something, the less general it becomes.
I agree. So the thing with hams though is that it allows you to put more restrictions on it. Right? It's not necessarily that you have to exercise that option always. Right? You could build a ham that is more general. Right? So essentially that would mean that every choice. So another thing with the hams and MaxQ is that they actually give you a hierarchy. Right? Typically in options is just a two-level thing. And if at all, there should be a hierarchy below that. I mean, so if you want to have a more complex hierarchy, it is something which you really can't learn, right? In options framework, you really can't learn the hierarchy even because your policies are given to you a priori. So in some sense, options is less rich in what you are able to express.
Interesting. So do you think that, or do you view MaxQ as ham as frameworks that inherently give you some ability to learn these options or macros?
Oh, the policies of these, yeah, they do.
Okay. Couldn't those mechanisms just be imported in the options framework? I mean,
it could. That's
seems
what
to me that
thesis.
options is not. It's just like a way of talking. It's just really the representation language. It's very general.
It's very general.
It doesn't restrict you any way of putting together these things. I mean, you could have options that use options. Why not?
You could have options that use options, but then if you do that, then you are now restricting your option structure. So basically, unless you impose the restrictions into the options framework, then you wouldn't have that. So if you say an option called call another option, you're essentially starting to introduce call graphs, like in MaxQ.
Okay.
Right? So yes, I'm glad Rich is not here, though. I mean, I wouldn't have gotten beyond this slide. I agree, but there's something. See, so what I did, part of my PhD work was actually adding everything that MaxQ does except the value function. Whatever decomposition, right? So MaxQ has a value function decomposition that goes along with it. Except for that, so everything else that you could do with MaxQ ported it into options and more. Right? So yeah, I agree that it can be extended to do a bunch of other things, but it's a very minimal setup. Okay.
Maybe minimal is good.
Minimal is good. I like it because I work with options. I don't work with MaxQ or ham or anything. And I did say that options are become more or less the standard which people are using, and maybe an occasional MaxQ framework thrown in here or there. Right? Nobody uses ham, not even Ron Parr or Stuart Russell anymore. Do they? Not that I haven't seen a ham paper in 10 years.
So my original question was, what constitutes a framework though? And I'm not sure that, like, apart from the examples that we see, we do have an answer of, like, what do you think a framework for Haskell RL should be?
Yeah.
So it should constitute maybe, a list of I don't know, these macros or options or whatever you call them, and I don't know what else. Like, is it necessary to have other parts or not? Maybe the answer is going to depend on what you want to use a framework for.
What do you want to use? Yeah, exactly. What do you want to do with this? Yeah. I'm not sure whether people have actually. I don't think we have an answer to that question. Right? As a community.
Okay.
But it's worthwhile working on one of those. Anyway, so let's move on to something more concrete. Let's look at options. Right. So options were introduced by Sutton, Dana Prekap, and Satinder Singh. So we actually had 2 of the 3 authors here with us, so it's essentially the easiest way to think about it is it's a generalization of an action, right? Where the action could take multiple time steps to complete. Right? So in some sense, I mean the MDP abstraction already allows us to define actions that could take several time steps to complete, real time steps to complete, except that you would be considering them in decision steps, epochs. So when you talk about MDPs in the abstract sense, right, one thing which you should appreciate is that the actions, even though we say there's an action at time t, an action at time t+1, and so on and so forth, they don't all need to necessarily take the same physical amount of time to complete. Right? So they are already abstractions in that sense. Right? So what options lets you do is actually look into those abstractions. Okay? Actually pay attention to what happens in the interim while an action completes. Right? So the option consists of a triple I, pi, and beta. So pi is essentially the policy that I'm going to follow while the option is in execution. Right? And beta is the terminal conditions. I tell you when does this action end. And I is the set of states where the option may be started. So I'll just show that to you in a minute. So let's take an example. There's this the example that was in the original options paper, right? And so I have these 4 rooms, okay? And I can learn options that tell me to exit a room. Okay? So from this room, I can say, okay, exit this room through this doorway. That is an option. Okay? So the policy pi that I'll follow while this option is executing are all the actions that possibly take me down here, okay, and then take me to the left and right appropriately in the last row here. So that's the policy that I will be following. So all I need to do is at some state here, I just need to say, okay, get out of the room through the bottom doorway, and then the agent basically should follow this trajectory if things are all deterministic. So likewise, I can define an option in this room that says that, okay, exit through this doorway or this, and so on and so forth, right? So what is my I and beta here? So the beta for exiting through the doorway at the bottom essentially would say that, okay, beta will be 1 for these states. That means that whenever you reach a doorway state, you stop. Right? And what are the states I should be able to use this option from? All the states in this room. There is no point in being here and saying get out of this room through the bottom doorway, right? So the option should be usable only in the states that are within this room. Right? So now I can just go and treat this option as yet another action. Right? So when I'm doing my learning, so instead of having the 4 actions north, south, east, west when I'm in this room, I'll have 2 more actions. One would be exit through this doorway, other one would be exit through that doorway. Okay? So basically I have 2 more actions. And now I can just go ahead and do my normal Q-learning or SARSA or whatever it is your favorite learning algorithm is. And of course there are a whole bunch of other complications with respect to learning algorithms once you have options, so more efficient learning algorithms and so on and so forth, but plain Q-learning should still work. Yeah.
It looks to me like in computer science that's what we usually do, that we do abstractions, so yeah, we create another abstract layer above it. Yeah. So here also we are, apart from having a view perspective or looking at these things, say we are at a start state and we have to achieve a goal. So does this provide any computational advantage as well, this framework of looking at including a hierarchy of abstractions this way, or just this is an easy way to look at and modularize things only?
Good point. So again, it depends on where you draw the line. See, suppose if I give you these options predefined, if I tell you, okay, here is this policy, okay, so I have somehow acquired it, or from knowledge, domain knowledge, and tell you, okay, here is a way to exit from this room. Now all I need to know is, okay, if my goal is here, how should I be putting these things together? So if you think about it, so from here, if I have to take a step every time I have to make a decision, then I have to learn each of those decisions along the way. Okay, I have moved one step down. Now do I move down or left or right? And now that depends on the status of my learning, and you saw how long it takes to learn in some of those tasks in Rich's demo. But now if I tell you that, okay, you have an action that will take you to the doorway directly. So that means I can just move from here to here without having to do any of the unnecessary exploration steps in between. Okay, that can significantly cut down the amount of exploration that I have to do in the beginning. So if I know what these options are to begin with. So another way which options can help us, I actually have a slide further down the line, what are useful options, but anticipating that, is to, suppose the goal is here, I learn a policy, right? Now I move the goal here. Can I reuse any of the old policy in terms of transfer learning, right? So options help me a lot. So knowing this kind of hierarchical decomposition allows me to reuse parts of the policy that I learned, not the entire policy. Right? So Satinder was talking yesterday about what are the different ways which you can transfer knowledge from one Atari game to the other. Okay, now we are saying that you can transfer parts of the policy, not the entire policy, by learning this decomposition. So that's another way that can be useful in cutting down computation. Of course, conceptually it makes it a lot easier to understand what is going on, but perhaps, I'm not sure.
Suppose, like in the previous talks, when we are learning in a completely unknown environment,
yeah,
and you have formed options, but as you have not specified to exit through the bottom door or something, so how will it learn? What will be the reward mechanism for it to know where it is, which door it is supposed to exit?
That's $1 million question. So Satinder asked this question: where do rewards come from? Right, in one of his talks. And the other question to ask is, where do hierarchies come from? But there are many ways in which people have tried to answer that. I don't know if there is one best way to do it. I'm going to talk about a couple of ways of addressing that question. But then, yeah, so that's a very popular cottage industry in the RL community. Keep churning out papers on ways of finding out these options, hierarchies and so on and so forth. I don't believe there is one great answer so far. Right? Don't look happy. Chaba? Okay. So any questions about the options, Siri? Right? So essentially now going back here, so this is my I, okay, my pi is the policy to get out, right? And the beta would be 1 for this option, it will be 1 here, for this option it will be 1 here, and so on and so forth. There are other nuances, let's not get there. So there are many algorithms that have been proposed for learning the overall policy. Now given the options, how will I learn the actual policy? Suppose the goal is here, now compose a solution for it in terms of the options. Right? How will I learn that? There are many algorithms for doing that. Any questions on options so far? Clear? Okay. So here, going back to your question. So what are good options? So we don't know what are good options. So how do we find them? Okay. How to represent these options? Once you find these options, how do you actually represent the options? Do we have any compact way of encoding these things? And another question which I don't think too many people have even asked is how to manage these options, especially if you're going to talk about an agent that's going to live for a long time and keeps acquiring these skills over time, right? And if I'm going to start having a huge library of these options, right, how do I even access them, right? So if I'm going to do Q learning, and if I have learned, say, 15,000 options over my lifetime, so how am I going to consider even 15,000 actions? Is there some way you can manage these options more effectively? So this is a question that you really have to answer if you're going to talk about having an agent that lives in a world for a long time and keeps acquiring skills like humans do. If you want to think of reinforcement learning as a model for human learning, at some point you'll have to answer questions like this. How do you manage these options? But then,
I asked you before also in the class, again relate it more closer to multi-agent setting as each options, wherein
it's orthogonal. You can think of options in the multi-agent setting.
because each option is multi-agent, and then
Not
again
necessarily. See, the thing is, the options, if you're having a single agent, the options will be executed serially, right? It's not like the options are being executed in parallel and you're getting emergent behavior from that and so on and so forth. But it is possible. In fact, in one of the computational neuroscience work that we are doing, we are actually modeling multiple brain regions that are controlling the same motor area, right? So in some sense, the signals are getting modulated by one another, and then what is the actual motor action that you see is an outcome of the interactions of these different signals. So, but that's esoteric in some sense, not usually done. Shall we have okay. So these are what I think are important actions and important research questions. But if you look at the kind of effort that is spent in the community, so this looks more or less like this, right? So there is very little work on trying to answer the question, what are good options? Everybody seems to have one definition in their mind and they work with it. Bottlenecks. So they should have one definition in their mind and work with it. And then how to find them, there are lots and lots and lots of papers, right? So people just write papers on how to find options pretty easily. But then again, there's not much work on how to represent the options, and very little work on how to manage options and so on and so forth. That's how the thing is. So let's look at these issues in turn. So what are goodness measures for options, right? So one very obvious definition of what a good option is something that connects you to hard to reach parts of the state space. Right? So if you think about it, all the rooms examples that we saw, right, everywhere, what you are essentially doing is you are taking a room which is fairly well connected space that I can go from anywhere to anywhere in the room easily, and then I go to a single point which is a little hard to access if I am doing a random walk. I go to the doorway. Right? Doorway is like one state or one particular state that connects me to another well-connected region. Right? So MDPs that have this kind of structure are sometimes called weakly coupled MDPs. Okay? So you have lots of states that are well-connected, and then there are these access states, okay, that let you reach another part of the state space which is again well-connected. Okay? So such kinds of access states are called bottlenecks. And so good options are those that connect you to bottlenecks, that allow you to go through these bottleneck states easily. Right? So if you remember the example I was telling you, so instead of taking a choice at every step along the way, now I can just immediately go to the doorway. So there is a single action that connects me to the doorway, which is a useful state to go to. Right? So this helps us in speeding up learning, right? And why does it help us in speed up learning? In some sense, it increases the connectivity of the state space, right? So it makes the states more well connected. So essentially, that directly cuts down on your learning time. Right? So if you increase the connectivity of the state space. So the second definition that people use for usability is that you can use the option again and again in a variety of different tasks. So you have a family of tasks. For example, Sridhar was talking about Pong and breakout. Right? So if I know how to slide my, whatever that is, the bat across the screen, either this way in Pong or this way in breakout, I should be able to reuse that in another problem. Right? So this is essentially a skill that you can learn from one problem which is usable in another problem. It need not necessarily be connecting you to bottleneck, right? But these are skills that you can repeatedly use in a family of tasks. Okay, so that's another definition of usefulness of an option, right? So it's essentially we're talking about transfer learning here, right? So I can learn something in one domain, I can use it in another domain. Okay? And the third measure of usefulness, which again is not that well studied or not very popular, is how compact my state representation can be by defining this kind of an option. So if you think about it, so in the taxi domain, when I say go pick up a passenger, right? So I don't really need to know exactly which cell in the world that my taxi is right now. All I need to say is wherever you are in the world, I don't care, go to that place where the passenger is. Right? In some sense, by defining my abstraction in that way, right, I can ignore some of the features. Right? So so what I claim a good measure, a good option is something that allows me to have this kind of maximal abstraction in the state space, more compact representations when I'm solving each of those tasks. Okay? So in some sense, this allows us to understand that, you have to first understand the structure of the domain better to be able to define something like this. But if you have a way of automatically coming up with options that would do this, then that in turn gives you a good understanding of the structure of the domain. Right? And another measure for goodness is something that comes more from a planning perspective. Right? So one thing that makes planning hard is if you have a lot of stochasticity in the world, a lot of uncertainty in the world. Right? So if I can define options that in some sense give me an invariant at the end of the option execution. Right? If I tell you that, okay, go pick up that diamond or whatever in Pac-Man, right? So, and regardless of the uncertainty in the domain, right? If at the end of the option, okay, if I can be sure that I have the diamond in my hand, right, I can just turn around and start chasing the monsters. Right? So, in some sense, this gets rid of all the uncertainty at the lower level, right? And allows me to have a deterministic world in which I can run efficient planners. And I don't think there's a single paper out there that tries to define options as making things deterministic. And people, it's just because it's hard, okay? Not because people don't accept that it's a good thing to do, because it's hard to get something like this happening. So there are a couple of papers where people actually have used this fact that options make the world deterministic. For example, there's some work that came out of Leslie Keilblink's group, where they run TSP for solving a path planning problem. Right? You convert it into a traveling salesman problem because the uncertainties are hidden away, and then you actually now have actions that tell you from wherever you are, you can go to the other point. Okay? So the cost might be varying, right? But you don't worry about it. But you can now solve this as a TSP problem with the expected cost for the navigation. Right? So the ideas like that can be tried. Right? So yeah, so most of this thing all talk about connecting to bottlenecks, right? So the very first option learning paper was by Amy McGovern and Annie Bartow, where they explicitly looked at bottlenecks in the state space, and bottlenecks were defined as states that you visit often on successful trajectories and which you don't visit often on unsuccessful trajectories. Suppose so I have another grid world task. There are two rooms. Okay. So I start from here and I have a goal here. So in all the successful trajectories, I would visit this state. Of course, I'll also visit a bunch of states in this room, in all the successful trajectories, which I won't visit in unsuccessful trajectories. Right? So now the trick is to find out this state, which is the distinguishing feature between successful trajectories and unsuccessful trajectories. If I manage to get through the door, then there is a larger chance of me succeeding in my trajectory than if I don't manage to get through the door. So one of the things with that work was that you needed to have a lot of trajectories, both successful and unsuccessful, in solving a problem in the world before you are able to figure out what are good bottlenecks. Okay. And once you figure out what the bottlenecks are, then you have to actually define an option to go there. Right? So once, let's say I figure out that this is a good bottleneck to have, right? Then I have to learn that, okay, these are the good states to start the option from. Okay, and what is the policy I should follow to get to the bottleneck? Okay? And of course, once I figure out what the bottleneck is, I figured out my beta. Right? So this is essentially how I figure out my option. Right? So first figure out the beta, then figure out the pi, then figure out the I. It goes in the reverse direction when you're doing these things. Right? And then there is a lot of work on using graph partitions. And one of the earliest and most complete one is by Shai-Banor's group. So where they essentially converted the MDP into a graph, right? And they define a Laplacian, random walk Laplacian on the graph, and then do spectral clustering on that, and then figure out which are the different clusters that the state should go into. So ideally, if you run spectral clustering on an MDP like this, you should say that, okay, these are in one cluster and these are in another cluster. Okay, and then you can say that your policy is now taking from one cluster to the other. And then you have to still do a lot of post-processing to figure out how exactly you are defining your options. Right. And a bunch of other things. I'll just talk about betweenness because we use it a little later, and as a comparison point. So how many of you know of betweenness from the social network concepts or graph theory concept? 1, 2. Okay, fine. So I'll tell you what betweenness is. So suppose you take a graph, right? You can score each of the nodes in the graph in terms of some kind of importance. So one measure of importance that people use is how many shortest paths on the graph. Right? So I can take 2 points I and j, 2 nodes I and j on the graph. I can compute all the shortest paths that go between I and j. Right? The shortest path need not be unique. Right? So I'll compute all the shortest paths that go between I and j. Right? So I'll do this for all pairs of nodes ij. Okay? So what fraction of all of these shortest paths pass through a node? Right? So that gives you the importance of a node. The higher the fraction, the more important the node. Right? So for example, again let's go back to this room. So if I take any state from here, okay, and any state from here, okay, the shortest path between those two. Okay, how many ever shortest paths are there between those two have to pass through the doorway? Right? So the doorway is going to have a very high betweenness score. Does it make sense? Right? So okay, the betweenness score is not 1 because if any pair of nodes here, none of the shortest paths will have to pass through the doorway. Any pair of nodes here, none of the shortest paths will pass through the doorway. But still, across the rooms, every shortest path. So it could be that if we start here, that could be one way of getting to this room. Okay, that could be one way of getting to this room. And in between, I have so many different ways, all of which are equally short of getting to the other room. But all of them will have to pass through this doorway. So it will have a very high betweenness score. So this was proposed by Oscar Simsek and Andy Barto. So where you compute betweenness on the graph. And Oscar extended it to use kind of approximate betweenness scores, and because betweenness is very expensive to compute. Looked at approximations of that and so on and so forth. And it does really well. I mean, it finds very good options. Okay. So what we are going to talk about now, the first, maybe the next 15-20 minutes, is this notion of metastability, which again is very closely related to graph partitions. It's just a different way of looking at partitioning. Okay. So
So in the literature on discovering options that you presented, is it assumed that the MDP is given to you?
Good point. This certainly assumes that you have the MDP. Right? That certainly assumes you don't have the MDP. Okay? And so betweenness, if you have the MDP, you can do a better job. Okay? But I have to check the latest variant of Oscar's work, whether it can operate without the MDP or not. So I'm not sure about that. So this doesn't need the MDP. This doesn't need the MDP. All of these only work from trajectories. Okay? And the bisimulation matrix needs the MDP. And so graph partitions in bisimulation need MDPs, the others don't necessarily need the model. And metastability, the initial part I'll talk assuming that we have the model, and then we'll see how we can do it without the model as well. But then you have to estimate the model. So I don't need to be given it a priori, but I need to estimate the model as well. Yeah. So the motivation that we wanted was, we normally need to have temporal abstractions, we also need spatial abstractions that go with it, because without spatial abstractions, the temporal abstractions are not really that effective, because it does not cut down on your decision making and so on and so forth. If you have to, so if you looked at the taxi problem, I was telling you the hierarchy. So when I want to pick up somebody, I really don't need to look at where in the state space the taxi is. I just need to know where it needs to go. So like that, it allows me to cut down on my description of the problem if I am able to do spatial abstraction as well.
In the previous slide, you talked about discovering options in the bottleneck setup. The first example which you showed, it had like the left topmost corner had 2 exits.
Yeah.
So how it will come to know which one is the better one? Which bottleneck?
It will discover all of those as bottlenecks. It could discover all of, let me rephrase it. It could discover all of those as bottlenecks. So why I'm saying it could, it depends on the kind of task, the trajectories that you train it on. Right? If you train it only on trajectories, for example, wherever that goal was, right, in that world. So the goal was here. So more likely the successful trajectories would have gone like this rather than like that. Right? So for this world, it might discover, this room it might discover the go out this way option. And for this room, it will discover go out that way option. Right? Not the ones that I have indicated here.
But if you're starting from the top left corner, and that is the third option in which the goal is located.
Here? Yeah, it's here.
So yeah, you have to, there will be one more option in the middle. So
Yeah, there could be multiple options in the middle. I'm not saying no. It could discover multiple options. I'm not saying no. Right? It's still possible. So basically it looks at the trajectory and figures out which are the bottleneck states on the trajectory, and then it figures out how to get to those bottleneck states. So every bottleneck state generates an option.
Like, so how will it come to know which bottleneck is the best one? Method running it should have.
See, all bottlenecks are important potentially in some problem or the other. So for which problem, which bottleneck is important, you have to run Q-learning and figure out. Right? So if your learning agent picks that option more often than others, then that bottleneck is important. So bottlenecks are essentially states that allow you access to another part of the state space. Potentially, all bottlenecks are important because it allows you to explore the state space better. Yeah. So the motivation was for us was to find regions of state space, okay, that are well connected, okay, and now I can pull them away and treat them as abstract states. For example, in the rooms world, I should be able to treat it as a 4-state problem. I'm in room 1, or I'm in room 2, or in room 3, or room 4. I don't need to actually go in and pay attention to it until I'm in that room, and I have to find the goal in that room. Okay, so until that point, I needn't have to pay attention to the actual cell that I am in the room. Okay, so I can just think of it as room 1, room 2, room 3. So this allows me to do that. So I am actually looking for this kinds of abstract states. Right? This is exactly what happens in the graph partitioning case. You partition the graph into connected components, and then you say that, okay, this component is one state, this component is another state, and so on. Right? So we looked at this concept of metastability, right, from conformal dynamics. So it's a metastable state. It's a long-lived state, but not truly indefinite stability. It's long-lived, but not truly indefinite stability. So it's a state. Suppose I'm doing random walks. Right? To give you the intuition from what we have been saying so far in rooms work, suppose I'm doing random walks. Right? If it's a fairly large room and a small doorway, then it's more likely that I'll stay within the room for a long time. Right? So the probability of me exiting the room will be smaller. So I can think of the room as being a metastable region for me. So if I keep doing a random walk, I'll just stay in that region for a long time. Okay, and with a very small probability, I'll exit the room. So I'm going to find such regions, okay, which if I start off and do random walks in, I'll stay within that room for a long time. And yeah, so that's essentially what I mean here. So we're going to study the behavior in the random walks, and identify such regions and designate them as abstract state. So one immediate example that you can think of is bottlenecks. Right? Suppose I start a random walk here, I'll be doing a random walk here and random walk here, okay, and except when I hit these states. Now my goal is not only to find the regions where I will stay in if I am doing the random walk, but also find those states which connect these regions together. Okay. Okay. So essentially, let's look at it this way. Let's forget the previous slide. This is the simpler slide to look at. Suppose I have my transition dynamics. I have some policy. Now I have a uniformly random policy. I pick all my 4 actions with probability 1 by 4. Okay, and my transition dynamics are somewhat like this. So what does this mean? So there are 3 regions in the state space. Right? Something like this. Right? If I start here and I do a random walk, okay, I'll just stay in that room. There is no way of me getting out of that room. Right? If I start here and do the random walk, I'll just stay in this room. There's no way of me getting out of this room. Start here and do a random walk, I'll just stay in the room. There's no way of me getting out. That's what this block diagonal structure tells you. Right? Okay. Now, if I take the Laplacian of this, and if I take the eigenvectors of this and try to project this onto that eigenvector space, right? So I take the top 3 eigenvectors, okay, and then you will find out that all these points will project to the first eigenvector and zeros on all the other directions, right? So essentially all of these points, all of these states here will project to this one point in the eigenvector space. All of these states here will project to this one point in the eigenvector space, and all of these states here will project to just one point in the eigenvector space. So you can look at this, there's a very clear separation between these points in the projected space, right? And I can treat each of these as a cluster. I can treat each of these as a cluster of states. Okay? But now that's not how it's going to be in real life. In real life, okay, if it's a weakly coupled MDP, because if the MDP is very strongly coupled, I'm not going to see any structuring, any clustering effect. If it's a weakly coupled MDP, so I'll see the same kind of structure, except that there will be some points where I can access the other clusters as well. So there will be some amount of leakage probability into the off diagonal elements. Does it make sense? There will be some amount of leakage probability here. Now, if I try to do the projection onto the eigenvector space, okay, so I'll find my points getting projected like this. Right? They're not quite aligning with the corners of the simplex. Right? So if you think about it, this is actually a 3-dimensional simplex. So it's not aligning quite with the corners of the simplex, but it's almost there. In fact, I can recover a closer match to the simplex by rotating the axes. So now the way to do clustering is essentially to figure out how to do this rotation. Okay, and once I find the best match, then I essentially assign the data points to the nearest vertex in the simplex, and that gives me the clustering. Okay, and this seems to work well across a variety of methods as opposed to running k-means on the projections in the spectral dimension.
Yeah, I was just wondering about whether you want to clarify what you are projecting when you say that you are projecting on the eigenvectors.
I'm projecting the random walk Laplacian.
So are you saying that you take a walk? You take a walk. You take a walk and then somehow you compute some underlying stationary distribution or
exactly, yeah.
Okay.
It seems to me that so this graph partitioning approach that was proposed earlier, right? So is this related or just another way to try and partition the graph?
It is another way to try and partition the graph. I mean, they also use the random walk Laplacian.
Okay.
Okay, and then they do the clustering but they use the standard k-means thing. So they do the projection onto the top k eigenvectors of the Laplacian, and then they do k-means on that. Okay, there are a couple of things here. So one, it required some kind of additional regularizer to make sure that your clusters don't, or are more balanced, okay, and so that choice becomes arbitrary in some cases, okay. And the second thing is it really does not give you the what to say, the access point, the connectivity between the clusters in a natural way as these guys do. Right? This is something which are using off the shelf. This is by Diffel-Hart and Weber. So we didn't do any modifications to the clustering algorithm as such. Possibly that we can twiddle around with it, but we didn't do anything. We just took it off the shelf and we're using it. And it turns out to be a really neat way of looking at clustering. So I had a discussion on this with Misha Belkin at some point about that we were using this. When was this? I think ICML 2013. And then in NIPS 2030, he had a paper which extended this to, I mean, not just this simplex version of way of looking at it, but completely a new theory on how to do spectral clustering or something like that. So I still haven't understood his paper. I've been trying for a while now, but I still haven't understood what he's saying. But it looks like there is something more interesting to be said about clustering in the spectral domain than just using k-means. This is just one simple application. Yeah.
So I'm a little bit concerned about two things, but maybe there are easy resolutions to those. So one of the things is that you can't say uniform choices, uniform random walk, uniform choice over the actions.
Yeah.
And that could be totally biased, depends on like what your action set is, right? So it seems that this could be really sensitive to what your primitive actions are and what they do. And so if you kind of like somehow, if I would add, for example, if I would duplicate some of the primitive actions, then you would get different random walks, right?
That is
The
true.
distribution would be like biased towards those that are multiply represented. And so it depends very much on what your action set is. And if you're talking about connectivity and what you can reach and so on and so forth, with planning, then this is maybe not much welcome properly. So that's one of the concerns. The other concern is that you probably want to have, at the end of the day, algorithms that are able to discover all this when working with observations and not with states and not with finite state spaces.
I'll come to that.
Okay, good.
Okay, that part we have looked at. But then it's a very seat of the pants answer to that. Okay, so we don't have anything formal right now. But the first part, right? So suppose I have multiple primitive actions that connect two states together, right? Wouldn't you just say that those are well connected in the sense that there are many ways to get there? I mean, should that be necessarily a bad thing?
I think this depends on what kind of planning algorithm you use.
That is true. I agree. So I mean, so random walk is just a choice that we made. Okay, whatever we are presenting doesn't necessarily limit itself to random walks. You could think of other ways of generating this structure, and then I mean, there could be a very restricted class of policies, and you could uniformly choose among those policies and still generate this structure, and then do the clustering on it. So there's nothing that precludes it. It's just we haven't tried it in practice. But,
Okay, I actually do have a third concern, if you don't mind. So I'm thinking about Sokoban.
okay.
Sokoban, it's a game, right? And it's a very hard game for many reasons. And one of the reasons is that it's really hard to get around in the state space in Sokoban. There are really long paths. And if you're starting from a particular state, then you can never, by a random walk, hope to access other parts of the state space. So this kind of assumes that you can fly to different parts of the state space. So you can like initially, just initialize the first state to any point in the state space.
Yeah.
And if that's not the case, then this is going to discover a part of the MDP. And in that part of the MDP, you can do your thing. But how to escape that part, it's not clear that it's happening that much with that.
Yeah, I agree. We didn't think of that situation. Right now, I've been assuming that the entire MDP is available to me, and there's a powerful reset. I can go into that. But then, yeah, so when we did it off trajectories, we did look at problems which needed extremely long trajectories, but we never analyzed it to see if we are stuck in some parts, or how does doing this. So essentially what we do is we run some trajectories, discover options from those trajectories, and then use that to now generate further trajectories. So if the options allow us to reach the boundaries of the known state space quickly, then the hope is that in the future trajectories you will generate more. So this is something that we'll have to actually look at carefully. Maybe we could run it on Sokoban and see what happens. Anyway, so I'll skip this parts, right? This is essentially the clustering algorithm that we use, right? It's kind of orthogonal, but you got the intuition behind what we do for the clustering, right? So it's essentially trying to find the rotation of the simplex, okay, so that most of the data points align themselves closely to one of the corners of the simplex. So instead of having the canonical axis for the simplex, we rotate it, and now once you get the rotation, I can start assigning memberships to these clusters, and then access points are those points which are equally distant from two clusters. Right? So I have cluster 1 and I have cluster 2. Cluster 1 and cluster, I can go from cluster 1 to cluster 2 by going to a state that is equidistant from cluster 1 and cluster 2, or more or less equidistant from cluster 1 and cluster 2. That will give me the access point. So it not only allows me to cluster these data points, but probably it gives me access points as well, okay? Because these things that share memberships are like that. So when I do k-means clustering, that's not necessarily guaranteed. Just because a point is between the centroids of two clusters doesn't necessarily mean that it is actually an access point. Well, here it actually means that. So here are some examples. So this is the domain. This is like a 10-room grid world, right? So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-room grid world. And when you do PCCA plus, you can see that it more or less recovers the structure. So the boundaries are a little fuzzy because of where exactly you draw the membership lines, right? But then, so you do unnormalized cuts, it does really badly. And this is n cut, and you can see this is what Shai is work did, right? So n cut also messes up some of the rooms, especially for example, this part, okay, where the first room turns into a long corridor, and then the second room continues that long corridor-like structure here, except that the corridor is broken here. Okay, but NCAT seems to miss that kind of a structure, and yeah. So PCCA Plus also has problems in having really long corridors. You can see that it actually splits it up into two things, because we really have a very long corridor, right? It's not clear what the connectivity from one end of the corridor to the other end is. Right? So depending on how you set your thresholds for partitioning, okay, you might split it up into two or keep it as one and so on. Right? And so we did this on another interesting thing. So this is a room within a room. Okay. So the room within a room. And so if I do any kind of trajectory-based bottleneck optimizers and so on and so forth, they'll find the top door as one policy, right, and the bottom door as another policy. And the fact that both of them get you to the same room would be lost in some sense, right? So that if you want to get out of the inner room, I can either go out through the top door or the bottom door. It's something that you'll have to discover further, right? So it could be an advantage or a disadvantage depending on what you want to do. I'm just pointing out the difference between what happens, right? So in this case, so it finds two clusters. This is essentially the membership function to the two clusters. So there is a cluster corresponding to the inner room, right? And it says that all these points have a high membership to the points in the inner room, and these have low membership. These are the ones that are outside. And you can see that the point where the doorway is, right, you can see this inflection. So the membership to the inner room drops a little bit, and the membership to the outer room also drops a little bit. Right, so these are the points where the doorways are. So you can easily figure out what the connection point is between the two rooms by looking at where the membership function takes a dip. Does it make sense? This picture is clear. So again, we run this clustering and find it. And so here is something which doesn't talk about doorways. It has a slightly more complex bottleneck, quote unquote. So there is a world that I have an object here that I need to pick up. Okay, and my state space is where in the world I am, okay, and whether I'm having the object with me or not. Okay, so the XY coordinates and the object. So these are my state variables. So here x1 tilde, okay, is the membership function for holding the object. Okay. So these are the x and y coordinates, the x and y axis here are the x and y coordinates. On the top panels, the state variable of object is without the object, okay, and the bottom panel I am holding the object. So you can see that, so for the first membership function, whenever I am holding the object, okay, the membership is high. Whenever I am not holding the object, the membership is low. Okay. Likewise for the second membership function, whenever I am not holding the object, the membership is high. Whenever I am holding the object, the membership is low. Okay, in both cases you can see a spike, right? So here the spike is going up and here the spike is coming down. That is exactly where in the xy coordinate. That's 415 in the xy coordinates, right? So that's exactly, so when I pick up the object, essentially I move from one cluster to the other. So now by just looking at this I can figure out, okay, the transition point is at 415, so I should learn an option to take me to 415 so that I can move from one setup to the other. Of course this, as with all spectral clustering things, we had to symmetrize this. So even though there is no way for you to put the object down, okay, so the dynamics suggests that you could actually go there and put the object down. So which is an artifact. So as long as we can come up with some directional spectral clustering approaches, we can solve this. Okay. So here is another example where you don't really need to have a physical doorway to go through, but something, a metaphorical doorway where you pick up an object. Right. So how do I derive options from this? Right. So setting the initiation set is, let's look at this. This is easier. Suppose I want to go from the inner room to the outer room. Okay, I want to learn an option to go from the inner room to the outer room. So the initiation set is trivial. So all the states where the inner room membership is above a certain threshold, right? When the inner room membership is 0.5 or more, okay, those are the initial sets, initial states. Okay. What about the termination condition? I already discussed that. So termination condition is where your thing dips to the lowest, and while this also is the highest. So if you look at it, okay, so this point, the membership to the inner room has dipped to the lowest, and from those in the outer room, this point has the highest membership in the inner room. So such a point will be the one that will be where you terminate your option. So now in this case there are two such points. So there will be one here, and symmetrically on the other side you will have another point. So there are 2 points where you can terminate your option. Okay. Now what about the policy, option policy? What is the policy that you will follow in the option? Right. So that is where this method is scores over the other methods, because all I need to do is I look at the local gradient in the membership function. I look at the local gradient in the membership function. So from here the gradient is in that direction. So I'll set the option policy to move in that direction. So if I have a model of what the actions will do, right, one step model of what the actions will do, all I need to do is set the policies such that I'll move in the direction of the gradient. I don't have to actually relearn the policies, I don't have to run trajectories to figure out what the policy for getting to the subgoal is and so on and so forth. I can just go in the direction of the gradient of the membership function, opposing the gradient of the membership function, and I'll get the policies. So once I do the clustering, I get also the option policies for free. Okay, so that's one nice thing about it. And so this is another example. So going from room 1 to room 2. So this is the room 2's membership function. I can either use the room 1's membership function, go in the opposite direction of the gradient, or use room 2's membership function and go in the direction of the gradient. So I can do either one of those. And it turns out empirically using room 2's membership function was better. So if you can look at this, so all the states in room 1 have some membership to room 2, right? And the closer you are to the doorway, the slightly higher is the membership. Now if I go in the direction of the membership, in any state, I want to move to the neighboring state which has a higher membership in room 2. Okay? And that essentially takes me like that. The policy is done. Yeah.
Could you explain in detail what you mean by membership? Like.
Okay. So we are talking about this. I skipped the details of the clustering algorithm, right? So essentially, the membership is a measure of how close you are to the respective simplex corner, right? So going back to here. So for example, this data point will have a high membership to this cluster corresponding to this corner, while it have a low membership to those two clusters. While this data point will have a high membership to this cluster, but it will also have a reasonable membership to the other cluster because it is partway there already. Right, so like that. So it's a kind of a measure of how close it is to the respective centroids. Okay. The respective rotated centroids. So that's basically what the membership function is. And so as you can see in this case, all of these have a high membership in the inside room cluster, and all these have a high membership in the outside room cluster, okay. Outer room cluster. Does it make sense? Yeah.
In all these frameworks, you consider the inherent problem of clustering that you are specifying the number of options.
I'm not. So that's the cool thing about PCCA+. Okay. So there are automatic mechanisms by which you can discover where to, how many clusters you need. That explains the data well, so on and so forth. So I'll have to be careful with that. So it works fine in whatever application domains that PCCA+ was originally used for. But when you're looking at MDPs, they have this measure called Windchild measure, which doesn't really work that well for MDPs. So we ended up falling back on the usual spectral gap for clustering. So you look at the even on the laptop here, just the window showing the slide went blank. The rest of the screen was on. Yeah. Yeah. So we use the spectral gap. So essentially, you find the eigenvalues of the Laplacian, right? Then you find out where the gap in the consecutive eigenvalues is maximum. Okay, and then you stop at that point.
This example, there is a doorway from 1 to 3 as well.
Yeah.
So now, and I specify the number of options as 2.
What do you want to?
So means either it can partition it into 1 and 2, 3, or because the bottleneck, it has 3 bottlenecks as such.
Yeah. So if you want to specify that, then
so
it's not clear
what
where
it would do? But it would.
It will have to break one room and have to cluster the other 2 rooms together if you are forcing to do it that way.
Okay.
But then if you look at the spectral gap, right? So that will be the gap after the third eigenvalue. It will not be, the gap will not be there after the second eigenvalue. No, but having said that, there are very complex domains. For example, in that 10-room domain, okay, I think it found 12 rooms because the gap was at 12. The gap wasn't at 10. Okay, so it does make mistakes. It's not so right. So the nice thing is, so once we have this kind of connectivity information, right? Suppose I want to go from say room 7 to room 3. Okay? So say I don't know 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay? So they're labeled from left to right, top to bottom. Right? Suppose I want to go from say room 7 to room 3. Okay? All I need to look at is how the rooms are connected. Right? Then I say, okay, from room 7 go to room 9. Then 8, then 5, 6, and then you can reach 3. Right? I mean, think about this. It's a pretty large world, right? So if I'm going to do this exploration, it will take me a long time. Once I have done the clustering, I actually have this graph that connects me from one room to the other. Right? Essentially, this graph is given to me by looking at which are the clusters which have data points with equal memberships in them. Right? If there are 2 clusters which don't have such data points, then they are not connected. If you don't have any such states, then they are not connected. So it gives me a very nice way of doing it. So you can do this planning, and right. So we also tried this on the online setting, right? So we wanted to do this without having the MDP present. Sorry. Yeah.
The membership values are computed using a uniform random policy, right?
Uniform
So
random.
acting greedy with respect to that might not give you the shortest path to the bottlenecks.
No, but then the membership function.
So if you had used another policy which which tells you that a state is closer to the outside room,
Yeah.
then
No, but then
it might-
I'm not having any bias in sampling any of the other states as well, right?
So in your current algorithm, you are going to take an action that greedily takes you to the down that function.
Yeah.
So all that you're doing is you're taking an action that will lead you to a state from where if you uniformly randomly walk. If you
No,
took
no,
a
it's not a
random
value
walk,
function. I'm not.
Yeah,
the
but it's
function I'm
somewhat like
descending
that,
is not a value function, right?
yeah, but it is, the membership.
So essentially, the
corresponds
point
to-
is, see, if I go here, I do a uniform random walk, I'll reach here closer than if I go there.
yeah,
Right?
but then
subsequently, I'm going everywhere. I'm doing the same thing, right? So.
yeah,
what
so
I-
you might get a suboptimal path is what I.
Might. I'll have to think about it. But yeah, not in a normally connected MDP. You'll have to do some work to come up with something where that will be somewhat.
May I try to turn the question around? So, are you saying that you're granted to get optimal execution with these heuristics when you're initializing the options based on the gradients? Is that necessarily true? Do you prove that, or what would that follow from? It looks like something reasonable as initialization. Whether it's going to give you the optimal thing, like you didn't take into account any rewards, any costs,
we
or
didn't take
anything
into
like
account
that,
any
right?
rewards at all, yeah.
Along the way. So if you
Yeah,
would
yeah, yeah. So
throw
rewards
in
are not
costs, for
taken into
example, then
account.
it can't do it.
Sorry?
It can't give you the optimum.
Yeah, because we are not taking the rewards into account. So if there are any bad events along the way, then it won't be able to give me something that's optimal. That is true. So just in terms of the transition dynamics, I'm not convinced. I think with a little bit of work we can show that it would be optimal. Because that, yeah, so we still haven't done it, we haven't nailed it down, but because we absolutely ignore rewards, so the question is moot, right? So we cannot be optimal, right?
So you can use that membership function to set rewards and.
That we could do. That we could. It's just that we have to learn more. So we'll have to run more trajectories, right? So if there's some way to shortcut that, then that will be good. So that's what we were trying to do. So we didn't want to learn because, one of the complaints against many of these spectral approaches is that they already require a lot of work. And if you say all of this you do and then you are going to give me bottlenecks, but now you have to do additional work to find out what the policies are, right? That becomes still another negative point against these. So we wanted to do something that cuts that time as well. But yeah, so still you have to do some more exploration with this. So we wanted to move from actually assuming that you know the world to doing something which is through sampling. So this is more or less work in progress. So essentially what you do, you generate trajectories in the world, right? So you do UCT style planning while you are actually operating, but then as you generate the data, okay, you keep augmenting the model of the world that you have, right? And what we do is, with the current model of the world, whatever you have learned so far, okay, you do the partitioning, okay, and then you learn options. Okay, figure out what the options are using just the current model of the world. Then you generate the next few hundred trajectories using, including those options into your trajectory generation. But then of course the trajectories you are counting only in the levels of the individual states, right? I'm not using the option transitions in order to define my trajectories. So the model building will still be in the individual states. And so one of the things which we do is when we redo the partitioning of the MDP, right? So we are going to get another set of clusters. So how do I know whether it's the same options that I had earlier or a different set of options? So we keep track of the mapping between one cluster to another by doing a matching on the simplexes that we find. Right, suppose we do clustering after 1000 trajectories and I get say four corners of the simplex, right? And then I go to the next, after another 1000 trajectories, I get 4 more corners. So I look at which states map to which simplex in the first set and the second set, which corner of the simplex in the first set and which corner of the simplex in the second set, and then I try to do a maximal matching. Okay, and then I say, okay, these are the options I'm learning, I'm keeping track of these options. And of course, sometimes it's possible that I get a new option that I didn't have earlier when I did this, in which case we initialize that as a new option. Otherwise, we try to keep the old options intact so that we can continue the learning with the old options value. So just because we generated more trajectories doesn't mean we have to start learning from scratch. If I'm able to find out which is the option that I was using earlier, I can continue learning from there. So that's basically what we did. And we are doing some rough idea from one of my students on how to incorporate rewards also in the option discovery phase, but we haven't explored that a lot yet. So how good are these options? So we looked at a 2-room world, okay? So where there's a very thin, narrow corridor of a room here and a much larger hall here. Okay, the reason we chose something like this was the NCAT algorithm makes a complete mess of this. Okay, it splits up the world into 2/3, 1/3. Right, so basically the bottom half is bottom third is one cluster and the top 2/3 is another cluster. So we thought we'll run it on this, and then so we used the PCCA plus options, and we used a bunch of baselines. So you're biased to move in a particular direction, which is something which Dynabrickup introduced as a baseline. So you put in a lot of options. Okay, that will just take you 10 steps to the right, 10 steps to the north, or 10 steps to the south, and so on and so forth. So if all that your options are doing is helping exploration in a blind way, these random options will also do that. And then we also used LCAT, which is a slightly modified version. But then LCAT actually found 12 options in the 2-room world. Okay, while PCCA plus found 2 options. Go from the top room to the bottom room to the top room. Okay. And so this is essentially the algorithms. So PCCA plus is at the top. The learning time is almost negligible. Of course, the number of epochs times 3000, so it's not 100 epochs, right? But the learning time is very, very small for PCCA plus. Well, random options also learn quickly, but then they converge to suboptimal solutions because they're not really taking you in the direction of where you want to go. And LCAT eventually recovers a good solution, but it takes a while for it to reach there because it has all these incorrect options that it has to explore and actually throw away before it narrows down on the more useful options. Right? And the tasks are randomly shifting goals. Each one of them solved independently. Right? So next thing we tried it on was the taxi domain we have been talking about so far. Okay? And in fact, I believe this was the first time somebody tried to do option discovery on the taxi domain. Because usually taxi domain people work with, okay, pick up passenger, drop off, and so on and so forth. There was one work in MaxQ, Hengst. Yeah, this is HexQ. It's not options though. He discovered MaxQ hierarchies. And what Hengst did was look at how often variables change. Right? So the x and y coordinates change quite often when I'm executing trajectories, but the location of the passenger changes very infrequently. Okay? So he identified those as sub-goals. Okay? Change the location of the passenger. That's the sub-goal that he would learn. And then he'll go, that essentially means that you'll learn to pick up the passenger. Right? So that's essentially how the HexQ framework worked. And it's fine in the MaxQ hierarchy where there were specific variables which are essentially indicators of change. Right? But it's not clear how well it works in general, and HexQ has been tried out only on the taxi domain as far as I know. So what we did here was again PCCA plus. Sorry about the color coding changing. Yeah. So PCCA plus is green on this slide. Okay, and again it does well. Again LCAT takes a while, but it does get up to good performance. And the thing with PCCA plus is it did find a lot of options. It found 20 options. But the options would be like, there's one option for pick up passenger from R, another option for pick up passenger from Y, okay, another option for pick up passenger from B and G, and so on and so forth. So it couldn't learn that nested hierarchical structure that we showed in the very first slide, right? And similarly for drop off all of these guys, it learned another 4 more, so there is 8, right? But it still learned 12 options, additional options, which was essentially, so it was something like navigate from this region to that region, because there is a wall in between, so the connectivity is not that great. So it learned options to navigate between points in space that are enclosed between walls to other points which are enclosed between walls. So it did learn a much finer discretization, but it allowed it to learn to solve the task very fast. So it's very hard to make sense out of this. This is again a membership function, okay? And so this color coded. There are 20 different clusters. Yeah.
Yeah. May I ask a question about how did you learn? How did you do this learning? So when you were doing the learning, did you just use uniform random as a policy and to generate the data for? So where is the data coming from?
Yeah. So for the taxi domain, I think no, for the taxi domain we assumed that we had the domain. So we had the world, the random walk, yeah, uniform random walk.
So in other words, okay, so you initialize the state to any particular state at your wheel, right? So you can fly in the domain. So
I didn't need to generate trajectories, right? I assumed that I knew the world.
yeah.
So the taxi domain, it's easy.
Oh, you just okay. So you write the actual transition
I did
properties.
the random walk operator on this. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so taxi domain was about the limit of what we could do with the full model. So when we did something larger, we then moved to trajectories. So far, this is the full model. So that full model equals the random walk.
This return includes learning the policies within that
This
option as well. Average return.
No, actually.
So what does
No,
that?
because our algorithm doesn't learn policies, right? So it would be unfair to compare against the policy learning time. In fact, we assume that the other agents knew the policies for the options as well.
Okay. So what your algorithm won't means it
When
will
I find the options initially,
right.
right? So I'm not accounting for that time as well. If that is what your question is,
Yeah. So
I'm not accounting for the time to find the options. Yeah, this is all assuming at this point at time 0 we know the options and their policies. And how long does it take me to learn how to solve the MDP? So that's all I'm plotting. Ideal framework it should be included. If you are actually doing this online, it should be included. Yeah, but then LCUT is something which is a model-based thing. It needs to know the model for it to do this segmentation. So I wouldn't know how to do the comparison fairly in that case. Right? So here is essentially you can see that these 4 things actually correspond to the passenger positions. So each one of these guys, okay, go pick up the passenger from there. Okay, so regardless of the taxi positions. Okay, so these are all when passenger is at 1. Okay, so this is an abstract state, regardless of where the taxi is, and so on and so forth. So it's a little hard to understand, but how do I show this? Okay, so the passenger position 5 means that the passenger is in the taxi. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4 corresponds to RGB Y. So in those 4 positions, passenger position 5 means passenger in the taxi. So you can see that in most of these positions there is a transition to that abstract state, right? So most of this there's a transition to that abstract state, which essentially means that okay, from here you can go to the position where the passenger is in the taxi, right? So when the taxi is at 5, which is essentially where one of RGBY is, like likewise when the taxi is at 20 and so on. So there should be one here at 10. I don't know what happened. And then there is one at 25. Right? So 5, 10, 20, 25 are where the locations are, RGBY are. So you can see that there is a transition from that position to the abstract state where the passenger is in the taxi. Right? So this is essentially those pickup options that you are learning. So likewise, you can go and interpret each one of those options. Some of these are drop-off options and some of these are pickup options. And the others actually map you from one point of the state space to another. Okay? So it will be good to get a visualization mapping these things. We should work on it. Right? And here's the thing which we did on Mario. So this is another arcade game, right? And people might have played Super Mario where you just keep running across the world, jumping up and earning points and so on and so forth. And it's got like just the visual representation, right? It's 25 power 352 states. There's no way you're going to do anything in the normal sense with it. So essentially there are 352 tiles on the screen, okay, and each of these could be in one of 25 states. Okay, so that's essentially where you get the state from. Right? And we used function approximator. So we used CMAC. Did Rich talk about CMAX? Okay, we used a function approximator. Let's just not go there. What the function approximator is. Almost out of time. And we use CMAX to represent the value function. Okay. And what we did was we assumed the tiles that are there in the CMAX. Right? So there is a vector that lights up. So the way CMAX works is as follows. So you are going to convert your states into some kind of m out of n encoding. So there are going to be n bits in the input. Some m of those n bits will be turned on. Right? So, and which m get turned on?
What is the observation here? Are you working based on the screen? What's on the screen? Or?
Yeah, I'm working with the screen representation.
So that's the input of the CMAX.
Yeah, so the input is a 352 dimension vector. Yeah.
Okay.
It's incredibly crazy, right? And then we used a really large tiling for the CMAX. So the n out of m is fairly large, right? And then an n was 2. And so the 2 tilings means that n is 2, and then we used a fairly large m. I don't remember what m we used right now. So now the trajectories we were sampling was not state transitions. Okay, we were just looking at the encoding transitions. Right, so now my state becomes this m bit, so 2 power m states, right? And then I'm just looking at transitions in this 2 power m space as opposed to the 25 power 352 space. And then I'm forming my transition matrix from that and doing my segmentation and so on and so forth. And we just did this on a lark, okay? We never really expected this to work. We just did this on the lark, and it turns out that it learns useful behaviors, right? It learns to jump up and down when it reaches a coin. So and it generally learns nice jumping behavior, right? So it learns to achieve a lot of the targets along the way. So what happened was, well, we compared it with Q-learning, which is the only thing which we could implement on this because we didn't know what are useful options to hand code options, and none of the option discovery methods work on this. We could try it with our same sampling that we did, try to do some bottleneck discovery on the tiling space. I'm not sure how that will work, but we didn't try any of those. And so essentially, so there are lots of side goals that the agent is supposed to get. I mean, running from left to right is one part of it, but then you have to jump on some monsters and kill them and gather coins and so on and so forth. And so essentially with the learned skills, right, we are achieving a lot more, larger fraction of the side goals than we were in terms of just running from left to right. So I should say that Q-learning did learn to solve the problem. Okay? Ran from left to right, jumped over, eventually learned to jump over obstacles using the same CMAC encoding that we are using. Right? It didn't fall into a pit and die and so on and so forth. In fact, it was much faster than us in completing the task because we were actually going up several levels, trying to get some things and so on and so forth. So in terms of higher goal completions, the side goal completions, we were much better. And you do get rewards for completing the side goals. So whenever you pick up a coin, you get a reward. Whenever you kill a monster, you get a reward. And so on. And yeah, some of the options it learned were pretty inexplicable. So there was one option it learned which just made it jump up and down in the same place for 10 times. So we don't know what that means. It just learned that. and that was good, right? So we're looking at so the PCCA plus, the clustering algorithm itself, okay, has a variant that works on continuous actions, continuous state space, right? So it doesn't need to be discrete states, and whatever I described, the intuition kind of carries over to the continuous domain. And so in theory we can use it on continuous in DPs as well. Yes, we haven't looked at it. And of course we want to incorporate symmetries in the world. Right now the PCCA plus algorithm does not care about symmetries. So it might discover symmetrically equivalent parts of the state space as different clusters. And because we need to handle rewards, we don't know how to do this. And well, there's another part of this talk where I was going to talk about small world options. I'm going to talk about that and this, but I'm not going to get to that. And so this is something that we are at, right? So I was going to talk about small worlds. Maybe I can do a 2-minute version of it. But are there any questions on this so far? Okay, good. So small worlds. So people must have heard of this small world. It's a small world. I mean, you can reach everybody within 6 hops of one another. Blah blah blah. All of those things. Yeah. So this is the idea that came from social networks community, that you can reach anybody within 6 hops, right? So the key insight was that if your network has a structure such that your neighbors, the distance to your neighbors, right, is the probability of finding a link of length d. What I mean by link of length d, if the link was not there, okay, it will take you d hops to go from point A to point B. Okay. So the probability of finding a link of length d is proportional to, inversely proportional to d, right? So it's like, right, so that's basically, so it's 1 by 2 power d or something. And so the basic intuition is this, right? So if I have links like this, let's say I'm in a grid world, so if I have a link that kind of spans certain length d, right? And if I'm able to distribute these links such that they satisfy the inverse power law, then essentially my MDP becomes a small world, and I have cut down on the expected walk length, to go from one point to another. I cut down on it significantly. So what we did essentially was came up with a technique for essentially doing this kind of random sampling of points from trajectories that were generated, right? And then randomly set goals, right? And randomly set sub goals and said, okay, I'm going to learn options to go to these sub goals. So you could think that I'm going to generate a lot of such options by randomly generating it, but then we restricted it. We said for every state we'll add only one option at most, 1 or 0 options. So I'm not exploding my branching factor. Every state will have one option extra. So basically I'm restricting the I of that option to one state. The I pi beta, I restrict it to one state. And then, a bunch of things which we had to take care of to make sure that it's actually a functioning algorithm. And it turned out that, so we were getting a lot better performance. So this is a slightly weird graph. So this is cumulative return from the beginning. So I just keep adding up the returns that I am getting. So it's not like per episode return. So from the beginning of my training, okay, how much return have I been getting? So because initially I was doing badly, so my slope will be negative, right? When my slope turns positive, that is when I have started learning, right? So I started learning the policy. So you can see that, so I used betweenness based options, so that is a red curve, right? I use betweenness based option, it takes a while to learn. This is the rooms world example, and so this is the small world options, and they are learning much faster, right? So than using betweenness options. So I should tell you that this is a different rooms world. This is not the one that we saw, the one with the 4 doorways. This is a uniform rooms world, okay? And where I can just switch goals around anywhere. So the starting state and the ending state could keep moving around, and you have to find the appropriate option. So in this case, having a betweenness option really didn't make much of sense, right? And then we tried on the taxi domain. So there is no real option discovery here, right? So we just did this. So the small world options did well, in the arbitrary navigation case. And then in the rooms world, of course, we did much better. So this is stopping it at after some 10,000 steps and looking at what the average return is so far. But the taxi domain, we did really badly because the betweenness options, when we ran betweenness on this and discovered the options, they were essentially the pick up and drop off options. Right? Once the betweenness options were there was really no learning. We just had to figure out when to switch from one location to the other. So there's really no learning. It's very hard to beat that betweenness options. And yeah, so we did a bunch of other experiments. And where here we gave a fixed budget. We said you have to learn the betweenness options, but then you can use 10 power 6 epochs to construct the MDP and so on and so forth. Everything from option discovery to figuring out the policy. And you could see that small world option was really way better than what you could get with the optimal betweenness option. In fact, the optimal betweenness option, okay, and the small world option that was given only 10 power 7 epochs were more or less comparable. So the best that we could do with betweenness, we could achieve with a budget on the small world option case. So the takeaway is that you could learn good performance with just dumb options, in some sense randomly generated options. Okay, that just follow some mathematical property. So is there something that we are missing, right? And yeah, so I'll stop here. I mean, I have a bunch of things I want to talk about after this, but I don't think I have time. Yeah, so this is my take-home message from the whole talk, even though I never got to the AI part of it. So for managing options, what I wanted to say was a lot of work has been done in say something like expert systems community, where they have huge rule bases and then they figure out how to manage those rule bases. So maybe you can take ideas from there in order to manage options. Likewise, in finding useful sub-goals, right? So people in the planning community have done a lot of work on that. And maybe you can take ideas from that into RL. So the basic idea is we need to explore connections to other AI disciplines. We are now exploring connections full steam ahead with statistics and applied math and OR. Maybe time to look at the other direction, go back, look at other history of RL, look at the AI connections and try to take away messages from that. So that's basically, so a bunch of students have been involved in some of this work that I didn't speak about. Questions? Yeah.
In the room example, the bottlenecks are fixed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like when you come back to the Mario example, like the bricks, for example, are constantly changing.
Yeah.
So, how do you identify? Because it's like, what do you say? The state is no longer the same. The state, like the position of these bricks.
So how do you describe the state space, right? I mean, in Mario, the idea is that there is some underlying stationary state. It's just that you are running around it. Right, you are looking at different parts of the state space as you run around the world, right? It's not that the state itself, it's non-stationary.
So is the state centered around the character, Mario?
Yes, right now, yes. Right, that's so wherever the character is, you see a window around that. It's extremely partially observed. That's why I said there is no hope of that actually working, but it did give some, empirically it gives us some.
Could you give an example of an option in that case?
So like I said, right, so if you find a coin up there, right, so it jumps to get the coin. So that is an option that it learns. So there's a state, if it comes to a state where there's a coin up there, it jumps up to get the coin. But then it also jumps up in other cases, even when there is no coin. I believe that is because of the fact that we define the options on the abstracted state space, right? Whatever is a CMAC activation, we define the options on the CMAC activation. So it could very well be that that state was getting activated even when there was no coin for whatever reason of the mapping in the CMAC. In fact, we even use hashing in CMAC. So it could very well be that some arbitrary state gets hashed to this, and therefore you just jump up even when there is no coin. That's what was probably what is happening in the options that we are observing. Right? Just jumping up and down in the same place for like 10 times, even though there was no coin there. So it could very well have been one of those perceptual aliasing things that are happening. Any other questions?